Well, the effect of sanctions on the North Korean economy is complicated because there are a range of different sanctions which are currently in play. So let me divide those into three baskets. The first set of sanctions that have been implemented most recently are under UN Security Council Resolution 2270. And those multilateral sanctions, of course, had to be negotiated between the United States, South Korea, and China, most significantly. Obviously, other parties were involved, including the Russians, but their role was a little bit less central. So in the course of designing those sanctions, the big surprise was the willingness of the Chinese for the first time to go after commercial trade. And that took place in part through a willingness to tighten sanctions on shipping, on aviation fuel, and most significantly on coal. But now we're seeing that since those sanctions have been negotiated, the political climate has changed somewhat, particularly because of the announcement with respect to THAAD deployment. And as a result of that, we're seeing, I think, a slowdown in the willingness of the Chinese to implement the multilateral sanctions. So my prediction would have been that a full implementation of the 2270 sanctions would have had a very strong influence on the North Korean economy and might have even triggered a financial crisis if fully implemented. But the exemptions on those sanctions, which the Chinese were able to negotiate as part of 2270, have been fully exploited, and as a result, the effects of the multilateral sanctions have not been as strong. Now, the unilateral sanctions that have been imposed by the Europeans and the United States appear to be having somewhat more significant effect. And in fact, the recent defections that you're seeing in Europe, and we've only seen the first several of those defections, it's possible that new ones will be announced shortly, are the result of some of the unilateral sanctions that have been imposed. And in particular, the Europeans are making it more difficult for North Korean embassies in Europe to conduct various illicit and legal activities in the EU, including labor exports, as we've seen recently in Poland, but also a variety of other illicit activities and scams, frankly, like insurance scams that the North Koreans have been involved in that have generated income for the regime. So the European sanctions appear to be having some effect. And then we have an issue which has not been noted recently since their announcement, but the US is also pursuing secondary financial sanctions. And those are more difficult to see. They're less visible because they operate through the banking institutions in banks outside of the United States, because the United States obviously doesn't have financial ties with North Korea directly. But the basis of those unilateral financial sanctions from the United States is to restrict the ability of North Korea to bank, even in countries like Russia and China, which are more supportive of North Korea. And they operate because the banks in question can have their access to the American clearing system restricted if they take North Korean accounts. So I suspect that all of these measures in combination still leave open the possibility that North Korea would actually experience something like a financial crisis in the future, as long as China doesn't play the role of continuing to support North Korea, which they currently appear to be doing after the THAAD announcement. So the question of whether China is interested in enforcing sanctions, either the multilateral sanctions or bilateral sanctions, is complicated, obviously, by the nature of cross-border relations in the northeast part of the country. But let me back up first and talk about the larger strategic context, because the enforcement of the sanctions is also related to the diplomacy between China, the United States, and South Korea over this issue. As you know, China has stated repeatedly that it's committed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but it also is committed to what it calls stability on the peninsula. And that means two things. It means not only an absence of militarized tension, but it also means, I think, the stability of the regime. And so clearly China is concerned about any demands for sanction enforcement that they believe would have destabilizing effect on North Korea. So right from the beginning, there's a conception of sanctions enforcement which limits what China is willing to do. Now then you have the question of what's going on in the Northeast. And here, there's certainly a border trade which the government doesn't entirely control. There's smuggling, there's small-scale trade, and so forth. But I'm a little suspicious that Beijing can't control this if it doesn't want to. And in fact, one of the reasons why we think that China was willing to sign on to a coal-related sanctions is because there's an adjustment process happening in China with respect to the coal industry, where the Chinese government is seeking to limit its dependence on coal and to restructure the industry by closing down mines. So even the coal sanction fit to some extent with domestic political interests. Over the longer run, I think that we've seen pretty good evidence that China is committed to a long-run strategy of engagement with North Korea. And the sanctions debate has created tensions with that strategy because ever since 2010 at least, and even before, the Chinese government has been pretty explicit in stating that it believes that openness and trade and investment with North Korea is a way of moving reform forward in the country. And I'm not unsympathetic with that view, but it does have the effect of limiting what China is able to do and willing to do in the short run. Well, the question is whether the reform process that's going on in North Korea influences the vulnerability of North Korea to sanctions. And the short answer to that question is clearly yes. We have tended to think of North Korea as a small closed economy, but increasingly we have to think of North Korea as a small open economy. Now, the two indicators that are typically used to discuss openness are quantities and prices. On the quantity front, we don't really have a very good sense of what the size of the North Korean economy and what the trade share is. But we do know that prices in North Korea are sensitive to prices in the rest of the world economy, for example, food prices. So in that sense, the North Korean economy has to be thought of increasingly as a small open economy. Now, when we think about how sanctions affect a target country, I think there's a misconception about what typically occurs after the imposition of sanctions. This isn't a process necessarily which leads to a slow squeeze on the economy. If we look back, for example, to the Iranian sanctions that were imposed in the middle of 2012, when oil exports were coordinated and reduced among the major oil consumers, Iran's major customers, we saw very quickly after that announcement a fundamental change in all prices in the Iranian economy as a result of the depreciation of the black market exchange rate. And so one of the things that I think is possible in North Korea and that hasn't been discussed as much as it should be, is the possibility that North Korea would experience something like a financial crisis. And I draw the parallel sometimes to South Korea in the fall of 1997. People laugh at that, but remember that these financial crises can occur very rapidly because if confidence is lost and holders of won decide that they want to purchase commodities or dollars or yuan or euros, then the exchange rate can depreciate very rapidly and prices can rise very rapidly because people are moving out of domestic currency into commodities, like foodstuffs, for example. So I think that when we talk about collapse, the concern is not a political collapse of the country, But the possibility that could unfold as sanctions start to bite is that a loss of confidence would result in this kind of financial crisis where North Korea doesn't have access to the foreign exchange required to finance its imports. And in that instance, as we know, that pressure is manifested even in a country like North Korea in the first instance on the exchange rate. So those are the kind of dynamics which I think we've been looking for with respect to the sanctions. And what we've seen is a surprising stability in rice prices and the exchange rate, which to me is an indicator precisely of the fact that China is not really enforcing the sanctions, because if the sanctions were enforced, we would expect to see those kinds of pressures. So I think that at the diplomatic level, one of the things that the US and South Korea have to do is to be very careful in reiterating what the purpose of the sanctions regime is. And if you recall, if you read 2270, the US and South Korea focused on the first part of the resolution, which is devoted to the sanctions side, but paid less attention to the fact that the Chinese were calling for a return to the negotiations, a return in effect to the six-party talks as part of this process. So I think that when the president says things like North Korea is shaky, that it's potentially unstable, this actually doesn't help the diplomatic process, because if the Chinese think that the objective of sanctions is regime change, then obviously they're going to be less willing to participate in enforcement. So the question is, what are the ultimate purpose of sanctions? And clearly there's a division in the United States between a majority, I think, in the policy community that see the purpose of sanctions basically as a way of getting back to the six-party talks, and a minority, a more hawkish minority, that believes that possibly if smart sanctions are pursued that really attack the assets of the leadership, then you could actually generate a regime change. I don't think regime change is a policy. I think regime change is a wish that we all have. We all wish that North Korea was not North Korea. But that's not a policy. The policy is that the purpose of the sanctions is to return to negotiations. So let me speak a little bit about how such a negotiation process would unfold, because currently there's a pretty sharp division between the US, China, and North Korea on this issue. North Korea's position, as you know, has been that prior to any discussion of denuclearization, a confidence-building process should be instituted through the beginning of a peace regime negotiation. And I don't think I have to state that no American president is going to sit down and engage in a peace regime negotiation with North Korea while it's continuing to reprocess, enrich, and pursue its missile program. So the question at this juncture is whether the Chinese proposal that was made by Wang Yi earlier in the year to have some kind of negotiation that either phased the discussion of nuclear weapons and the peace regime, or combined them into an omnibus discussion, whether that proposal can be fleshed out and given enough concrete detail that the US could respond to it in a new, likely Clinton administration. And at this juncture, I think that there's not enough detail there for the United States to really know what the Chinese proposal is, and more importantly, how much muscle the Chinese are willing to put into that proposal. Because the US and China also have different approaches to who should lead this process. I think China believes that the US should engage directly in bilateral negotiations with the North Koreans to provide assurances, even if those aren't on a peace regime, and that out of those discussions would come some return to the six-party talks. No one in the United States believes that that's likely to occur, and not because the US doesn't talk to North Korea, because the US does talk to North Korea, and it's been willing to talk to North Korea in Track 2 and other settings, including the New York Channel, which the North Koreans unfortunately have recently closed. So the US position has actually been to make quite significant concessions from what we initially held, which was the view that prior to coming to negotiations, the North Koreans needed to make concrete commitments, such as those that were made during the leap year deal, of either freezing their facilities, admitting inspectors, making a commitment not to test. But at this juncture, I think the United States and South Korea are down to something which is even simpler, which is they would just like to see some commitment publicly on the part of North Korea that it's committed to the joint statement of 2005 or to some negotiated process of denuclearization. And as we saw from the Party Congress earlier in the year, it's been very difficult for the North Koreans even to make that kind of commitment. So unless we can get some sort of commitment to a negotiation process that includes an ultimate aim of denuclearization, I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States to take the lead in opening this kind of omnibus negotiation.